And we're live. It is Monday, October 1st, 8 a.m. in Washington, 4 p.m. in Kiev, 3 p.m. in Kiev, which is the perfect time for coffee and wine. And, yeah, oh my God, that's actually kind of disgusting.
It's
Uh,
not.
do you mix coffee and wine?
I mean, I don't like mix it, and I think she's disgusted as well, actually.
Yeah, no, I think she agrees with me. Um, you are watching Dogshirt TV, Kava and Vyno, coffee and wine, which is when we do this at early in the morning, Washington time, afternoon, Kiev time, and we shoot the shit with Anastasiia Lapatina. And what's on the agenda today, Nastya?
I thought we don't have an agenda.
There's no agenda. But Lloyd Austin is in Kiev for a surprise visit. I guess he knew we were doing this show and wanted to create some dramatic tension.
Clearly.
Do we know anything
Clearly.
about what he's up to?
I haven't seen anything, to be honest. I only saw the news pack that he arrived. I mean, it's probably around like the victory plan discussions and just jotting down some of the details of that and further negotiations.
But it's weird to do that 2 weeks before the election. Yeah, I do. I think anytime a senior U.S. official shows up in Kiev, it raises expectations among Ukrainians that we're going to have a relaxation of the strike, long-range strike issue. It raises the possibility of some. I mean, the Secretary of Defense doesn't show up for a routine consultation, right? So there's something they're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's weird before the election, to be honest, because these visits happen pretty often. Like, it seems like a very big deal because he's a high-level general. Is he considered?
Well, he's the Secretary of Defense. I mean,
yeah.
you know,
Well,
he's
a military defense person. He's a high level with that. So it kind of seems very important, but at the same time, like, we've had Blinken come in, we've had a bunch of congressmen come in. They come in periodically. I feel like it happens more often than people notice, maybe.
right, but congressmen don't count because they travel when they feel like traveling. They, that's more like, some some dignitaries. But when Blinken or Austin shows up, they're showing up in some combination of envoy of the president. They're coming to talk to Zelensky. They're coming to negotiate very specific things that are on the table. And the only word I have about it is he's there to discuss Ukraine's weapons needs, which strikes me as code for, more consultations on the long range thing. Ava, do you want to introduce yourself?
Ava, say hi. Say hi.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
It's really funny.
For those who are listening, we are waving at each other.
Yes.
How old is Ava?
She is 9.5, almost 10. 9 months and 3 weeks exactly, actually.
And for those who have not read the story of Ava's birth, where can they find it?
That's such a smooth ad placement. Incredible. Someone has to pay you for it. I need to think about that. Yes. I have a Substack. It's called Yours Ukrainian, and we were struggling with the link in one of the episodes. What is it, Ben? yoursukrainian.substack.com, I think, is
Yeah.
the link.
Yes.
Okay, great. And so my very first essay, which many people liked, on there was the story of her birth. Not like literally the story of her birth, but kind of around it, because it was very dramatic. There was one of the biggest Russian attacks against Ukraine during the entire full-scale war happened like 2 days after she was born while we were at the hospital. So it was really dramatic. Like the entire hospital was going to the underground shelter. It was a whole event. So I wrote.
Ava was literally born under fire.
Yeah.
So, a reminder, this is the first show that we are not streaming to YouTube. It actually might accidentally be streaming to YouTube. I'm not sure. But it's not supposed to be streaming to YouTube. I'll have to check whether it actually did that. But we will be posting to YouTube after, along with the podcast. So remember, if you're joining us in the Greek chorus, you can cut in any time with questions, comments, screams of protest, howls of rage, cries of agony, cri de coeur, whatever. You know how to do it, and you are expected, because I do not police things, you are expected to dismiss yourself afterwards. So, Nastya, it is getting cold in
We just got a
Kiev.
new aid package.
Oh, interesting. We have breaking news on
Yes.
Kava y Vyno. What do we know about the new aid package?
Yeah, so I mean, Lloyd Austin probably at some briefing just said that we got a new we got a new aid package worth $400 million. So that's that.
I
mean,
wonder.
It's not that much of breaking news, but yeah.
Yeah, it's also a small amount of money. I
I was gonna,
wonder if
it's yeah.
it's some kind of bespoke weapon system or something, because that's.
We have John in the chat, chatting with us. We should probably interact with that.
Oh,
Yes.
is that the estimable John Hawkinson?
Yes.
John is sending some information. Let's see.
He's apparently more informed about the news in my country than I am, so that's a thing.
Well, John is a very thoughtful guy. John, if you want to come on and deliver this information, I am not always able to monitor the chat.
I can do it. Oh, here we go.
Hey,
John,
good morning, Ben.
Good morning. What's on your mind?
And Riverside haven't been so great, so I figured I'd try leaving it off. So I was just quoting from the press release that the DoD sent out this morning, and it indicated what Lloyd Austin was supposed to do. I mean, notionally, it's not the same as what he actually does.
Yeah.
And what is the substance of it?
All right. Meet with Ukrainian leaders and reiterate support of the United States for Ukraine's fight for freedom.
Yeah, boring.
Right. Meet with leadership, underscore, blah, blah, blah. Commitment to providing the security assistance it needs to defend itself from Russian aggression. And lastly, and I'm not sure, you need to decode this for me as to how meaningful it is. Maybe it's meaningless. Deliver a speech to highlight how Ukraine has skillfully fought back against Putin's war of choice, the U.S. commitment to ensuring Ukraine's armed forces have the battlefield capabilities they need, and why Ukraine's fight matters for U.S. security.
Okay, so I will say that none of that is a plausible explanation for why he is in Kiev now. All of that is like why you might schedule a event not 2 weeks before an election and schedule a trip, but showing up unannounced right before an election strikes me as meaning that something very specific is under discussion.
You guys, I need to break in this conversation for a sec because I just saw another piece of news in Ukrainian media that apparently Trump told the Wall Street Journal that he threatened Putin with strikes on Moscow if he invades Ukraine. He literally, apparently, from what he told the journalists, he apparently told Putin that, Vladimir, if you go to Ukraine, I'm going to hit you so hard you won't even believe it. I'm going to hit in the middle of freaking Moscow.
Yeah, I don't believe a word of that. And I would also just point out to all of the non-Russian speakers listening that when you address Putin, you either call him President Putin or Vladimir Ivanovich Putin, or you call him Volodya. You don't call him Vladimir. That's like
It's
goofy.
It is a bit
right?
weird. Yeah.
I mean, it's like calling, I don't know, people don't understand this. But so in Russian, if you say John, you have to add Hawkinson. Like it's like saying Mr. Hawkinson. If you want to address him informally, you have to use John's nickname, Johnny, or so don't call just a message.
Not necessarily, but usually, yes.
Yeah, don't call Vladimir Putin. I mean, you can call him Vlad. But I think that usually.
I really hope the leader of the free world doesn't call Putin Vlad. Like no.
So if you were Trump or Kamala Harris or Biden, and you had to address Vladimir Putin by phone, and you didn't, you were decided you weren't going to call him Khula or some name, you were going to just address him. What would you address him as?
President Putin. Which even that isn't correct. I don't know. I mean, this is kind of a journalistic question more than anything, but it's like, why does anyone call him president? Like he isn't a president lawfully. What he is a dictator. There hasn't been a single free election in the time he's been in office. I'm not even sure there has ever been a free election in Russia,
but dictator is not a title that, I mean, so you know where the word dictator comes from, right?
It's a word, I don't know.
It comes from the Roman Republic. And in the Roman Republic,
a lot of things come from the Roman Republic.
There was actually an office called the office of dictator. And a dictator was a temporary role that a consul could take on at the vote of the Senate. And it basically gave absolute power to deal with an emergency, and then you would step down as dictator. There was actually a pretty interesting history of consuls becoming dictators and in fact yielding up power afterwards. It was a really, really strong norm. And so there was but ever since then, the term dictator has been used almost entirely in the pejorative. So you see references to its original meaning, like in the Federalist Papers, when Hamilton is talking about a strong presidency, he says, how many times did the Romans turn to a dictator? But normally when we say it now, we don't mean it as hey, Mr. Dictator, I respect your office. Can we work on? We use it as a term of opprobrium. I've always wondered about this. If I were asked to address the Saudi king, being something of an opponent of monarchy in general and a real opponent of absolute monarchy, what do you call him? Crown prince, MBS? Do you call him Your Majesty? I'm not into that. I've kind of been like, yo, Muhammad.
What they call them?
Oh, I mean, they have all kinds of forms of polite address, and
Ridiculous, by the way. I mean,
yeah.
like,
I mean, why should I mean? I understand that's your form of government and anything, but why do you want me to respect that?
Yeah, it actually gets down to like a very broad and deep question that I have. Ava, you're making it slightly hard for me to interact here. Do you want to go play? Do you want to go play? Okay. She did not want to go play.
No, as it turns out, the answer to that question was no. Hi, Ava.
She's just stealing all the space today.
Yeah.
Just communicate with her.
I also like the fact that, the noise that she just made could reasonably be described as a howl of rage.
As a reaction to whatever you were saying before.
Yeah, that's more of a squeal of glee, but how you do good howls of rage.
Yeah. Well, so the thing I was talking about earlier is like, often when I think about this Ukraine, speaking of rage, when I think about Ukrainian like rage at the way that the West has always dealt with Russia,
like that.
Not talk. I literally cannot put in a freaking sentence, Awa. It doesn't.
Yeah, that does not trouble her.
Do I eat while I talk? Here. Okay, excellent. When apparently someone does not like how the West has dealt with Russia.
Yeah.
John said in the chat. Yes, exactly. I'm raising the child much to my likeness. So basically, when I think about that, about how the West has approached Russia throughout history, I often think like, okay, so Ukrainians are unhappy with that, and we would want the US to be like harsher or tougher with Russia. But what would that look like? Because it's like it's a broader, deeper question of how do you do politics with your adversaries? How do you do politics with like terrible people who behead other people, who kill other people? Like, how do you? Yeah, it's a very hard question, Amma. So it's like I remember one day I was just thinking about it, like, okay, we're all mad at the US, but how? Like, what should you guys have done? Like, what's the alternative? Is there an alternative? Right? Because it's like, what is it? Like, do you not trade with these countries? That's impossible. Do you not do any business with these countries? It's like this kind of philosophical question of like, that's just how the politics work. You have to say your kindness to the guy who beheads other people.
Right. So
like,
the question about Russia, right? You could theoretically try to treat Russia more like Iran.
Okay.
That is,
I like the idea. Keep going.
Complete and total isolation.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that Russia has immense natural resources.
Oh, do we?
Yes.
That's made a point saying.
Although, you will not sell them all to China, right? And Russia will sell all of it to China, North Korea, Iran, India, which shows no compunction about buying Russian goods right now. And so I think, in contrast to Iran, which doesn't have any natural resources that you can't get elsewhere, Russia actually has, because of the landmass, just this immense bargaining power in the international sphere. And that makes it very difficult to isolate completely. You can try, but they have a lot of negotiating room with a lot of different countries. And that's before you get to the problem of the global South, where Russia is in a position to undercut world food prices, to, ship oil at, very advantageous rates. And so I don't think it is plausible to do the kind of isolation with Russia that you can do with other countries. What is plausible is to deter bad behavior on much stricter terms than we have. And I don't know how plausible it is to get away with how much in that. The Woodward book is interesting in that.
Why?
Sorry?
I'm going to order that, by the way. I'm really curious.
Yeah, I mean, his sense that the U.S. intelligence community thought there was a real chance of nuclear escalation, I find interesting. Now whether that was,
we can unpack that.
So let's talk about this, but let's talk about it with the following background. The U.S. intelligence community was basically right about everything in the run-up to the war. We seemed to have Putin's inner circle quite penetrated, and we got all kinds of details right about the full-scale invasion. And so unlike, Iraq WMD, this is an area where I at least start with pretty high confidence in what our IC is producing. And they got, it seems, from Woodward, increasingly alarmed over the course of the first part of the war, until they determined that there was kind of a coin flip chance of the use of a tactical nuke. Every Ukrainian I have talked to about this has the same reaction, which is, roughly speaking, this eye roll. And accompanied by either, they're not going to use nukes, come on, grow up, or, look, if they do, it's a frickin' tactical nuke and it's on our territory. We're the people who are going to get hit with it. What problem is it of yours?
Exactly.
So walk us through it. Why should I be, as Stanley Kubrick once said in Dr. Strangelove, why should I learn to stop worrying and love the bomb?
Okay. Well, your package that has, seven books on the nuclear Armageddon still hasn't arrived to Kyiv, so I'll do all of that reading, and then we can get on another.
You can also watch Dr. Strangelove, which is the ultimate comic masterpiece about nuclear Armageddon.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, that's where that line comes from, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Well, so anyway, why I don't like this whole Woodward situation. I really hope he isn't watching this live stream. Knowing your friends, I wouldn't even be surprised if he was.
No, I have no evidence that Bob watches this. But if you want funny Bob Woodward stories, I have lots of them.
She's already laughing. You didn't understand. Kava, please. I need to comment. Please. Thank you. Okay. So the reason why I'm... So the reason why we're... She's just doing it to annoy me.
No, she's at this point, she's talking when you talk.
That it's annoying me. It's just...
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk to you? I can explain. Stop. I'm gonna do this with her duck. So the reason why I don't like this whole Woodward thing of it's not that I don't like the book. I haven't read the book. I actually want to read the book and I'm sure it's good. But the point that I don't like is he, in promoting... Okay, this is actually frustrating the hell out of me right now. I'm gonna give you off to your father because this isn't sustainable. Okay. He goes on all of these radio shows and gives all of these interviews to promote his book, and almost all of them either start or center wholly on this issue of the nuclear weapons and, this particular part of the book. And he brings all of these like transcripts with him of the call that Lloyd Austin had with the Russians, and how he threatened them, whatever. And like how this was a coin flip, of a situation, 50% chance of using tactical nukes. And everyone goes like, oh my God, like, this is terrible. This is so terrifying. Clearly implying in their voice that, like, thank God Biden was so good at mitigating it, and the US government saved us all by preventing Russians from using technical nuke. And not in a single, like, conversation that I've heard on this, and I've watched, like, maybe 3, no one is like, okay, what did Ukrainians think about this? Like, Russia was about to nuke Ukraine. What was the Ukrainian government saying about it? What were the Ukrainian people saying about it? Like, this is the main part of the question. Can you please hold her for 1 minute? It's impossible to talk. Thank you. Okay.
Hey, Eric.
Okay. So, and it's just really frustrating to me because we are right now pushing for the West to lift all of these restrictions on long-range weapons. And one of the arguments why the answer is no, and they're pushing back, is this fear of nuclear escalation. And many people who don't really follow the news that much and don't really care that much, they do know about it because it's a very easy argument, right? Like, we don't want to hit Russia, or we don't want to help Ukraine hit Russia because we're scared of nuclear war. It's a very easy argument for Americans to comprehend. And so what Bulbord is doing, he's like pushing this argument to the forefront of the Americans' public thinking again, right? And everyone is like, oh, nuclear war, oh, we prevented nuclear war, thank God. And it's like, has anyone asked us what we think about being nuked? Like, maybe we don't actually mind as much as you can. I'm not kidding. Like,
no, I know. But this is an area, I think this is a really important point. From a Ukrainian perspective, the use of a battlefield nuke in a sparsely populated area is awful, but it's not that different from serial bombardment over a long period of time.
Exactly.
From a US perspective, the use of a tactical nuke is a major world historical event that requires that the US get involved directly in the war. And this is just an area where neither side will ever understand, or they can understand, but they will never, right? The US perspective is Russian use of a nuclear weapon requires a direct US response. It requires defeat of the Russian Federation. Now, to Ukrainians, that sounds, well, great, bring it on.
We already need to defeat them.
Right, but on this, so far,
I'm losing you.
The U.S. sees, right, the moment Russia uses a nuclear weapon, we are in a completely different space in terms of U.S. degree of engagement in the war. I mean, I think you would have the U.S. immediately intervene with very fearsome power on the Ukrainian side the moment that happened. And I'm sure this has been wargamed 1,000 times in the Pentagon, and there are like immediate plans for what you would do. But again, this raises that fundamental distinction between the Ukrainian vision of managing the situation, which is fighting off the motherfuckers, and the US view of managing the relationship, which is containing containing them and while not blowing up the world, right? There's and I think there's just like no way the two sides will ever see eye to eye on that because their interests are different.
Exactly.
And, our view of it is, look, when I say our here, I mean US policymakers. Like, if Russia if there were a ceasefire in which Russia kept most of Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, this is a disaster for Ukraine. It may be a necessary disaster, but from the U.S. point of view, you could defer that question, right? We deferred it for 40 years with Germany. You could say, all right, hey, the goal here was to keep Ukraine alive, existing, to keep it independent, to move it toward the West, and to have it lose as little territory as possible and gain as much back as possible, and to weaken Russia dramatically in the process. Kind of accomplished all that. We'll deal with the rest later. And that's a plausible position for the United States, and it's a very hard pill for Ukrainians to swallow. And so I think there's, as you and I have discussed 1,000 times, there's just a lot of relationship management that needs to be done between UA and US in terms of just kind of understanding where the other side is coming from about these things.
Yeah, it's true. It's true that the US has never really. My assumption is that the US was never really conceptualizing trying to make Russia lose. Like that, I don't think that was the thinking. As far as I understand, the thinking was we're going to give the Ukrainians these little portions of whatever we have at that point. They're going to try to do their Ukrainian magic with sticks, stones, and a few javelins to push the Russians, not even push the Russians back, but just stop them from coming further, defend ourselves, as the phrase has always gone. And eventually the Russians are going to get tired and they will leave and we will drain them out. Well, that's clearly not happening.
Yeah, so I think the thinking that in some ways gives the thinking a little bit too much credit, and in some ways the thinking was more sophisticated than that. So remember that at the beginning of the war, there was no evidence available to the US that there was Ukrainian magic. The previous bout had been in 2014 when Ukraine had walked out of Crimea with no fight, and there had been a kind of low-grade fight in the east ever since. But and I think
saw the magic in the first few weeks of the war.
Yes. So I think, so we started with the even very sympathetic. I talked to Alex Vindman the day of the full-scale invasion started, and he said, this is going to be a 3-day operation.
Everyone completely misjudged it.
Right. So, we started with a much less sophisticated understanding than you just reflected of what the dynamics of the conflict were going to be. We started with the assumption that, Zelensky we would airlift him out of Kyiv. There would be a government in exile, and we would be funding a guerrilla war a la Afghanistan against the Russians. That was the working US assumption. And so we didn't start with, hey, we can give these little amounts, tranches of weapons to keep them in the fight. We started with the assumption that Ukraine was going to cease to exist. And we would be supporting a guerrilla war. That turns out to be wrong.
There are whole research papers done to analyze why everyone misunderstood it.
Yes, and look, there is one thing the Pentagon is super, super good at, and they've kind of pioneered, is the after-action report. The intelligence community too, when something does not go as expected, when something does go as expected, they do an after-action report about what we assessed correctly, what we assessed incorrectly. So there will be an enormous amount done inside.
There was a thing like that down in Iraq, right? I think I've read it.
Dozens of them. But they do that down to the level of specific operations, right? So you conduct an operation and it goes 60% according to plan, you study the 40%, right? And they really, really do after action reports and after action assessments. So look, they're going to study that. But then you're now 2-3 weeks into the war, and all of a sudden, this incredible thing is happening, which is that the Russians are losing. And what we understood losing to mean was not capturing Kiev, right? Like the government of Ukraine continues to exist. And so at this point, I think the analysis becomes more sophisticated than you're giving it credit for, which is, okay, what do we need to do to facilitate the immediate operational objectives? And what do we have available to give that can, help, this objective in this space, this objective in this space? And I think here's where I agree with you. They never sat down and said, let's define victory in the same way that the Ukrainian government does.
Yeah.
And let's ask the question, what do they need in order to accomplish that? And that's where I think the different interests just cause different ways of thinking about it.
But I mean, at the same time, I am like, I hope in however many years some American general is going to explain this to me, because I don't understand it. Like, you guys are pouring a shitload of money into us in terms of weapons, and it's like, you gotta have some sort of overarching idea of like what you're trying to do. Because if your overarching idea is the Russians don't capture Kyiv, then, well, that's just poor analysis, right? Like, we've established that we are much more capable than just stopping that. Like if you give us the weapons, we can achieve much more than you would previously assume. So it's like, what was the objective? What were they trying to do?
But look, remember, the U.S. has its own models for these. Like, we have what's the closest template to this? It's the Korean War. No, it's the Korean War. Okay. And where you have a sudden blitz invasion of the South, the U.S. comes in, we drive the Chinese and the North Koreans back almost to the international border, and then we start losing this, it comes back and back and back and ends up at the ceasefire line. We think of if you ask military analysts, they talk about the Korean War as a stalemate, right? Mm-hmm. If you ask politicians, it was a win. South Korea is a alive and thriving country, and we've kept it in the game. Does it have territorial claims on the North? Yes. Is there a humanitarian fucking cosmic disaster in the North? Yes, but South Korea is, a great ally, incredibly productive economy, and, quite secure. And
I never thought of that example, actually. This is a great example to unpack.
Yeah, so this is like, now, are there 100 differences with Ukraine? Yup. Are there, but from a U.S. perspective, the Korean War is a great, we've gotten, like 75, 80 years of peace on the Korean Peninsula, uneasy peace with a constant threat of nuclear war, and by the way, South Korea has never even gone nuclear, right? Like it's a really good situation for the U.S. And by the way, it's the third most costly war of the fucking 20th century. In terms of I don't know, it's like 4 million Koreans killed in that war. It's just crazy, crazy high casualty numbers. And so I look at it and I say, well, I totally understand both sides of this conversation. If you look at it from a Ukrainian point of view, you say they need to be beaten. We need to take back our territory. there are all these people in Crimea who shouldn't be living under, and Donetsk and Luhansk, who shouldn't be living under Russian occupation. This is an unacceptable situation. If you look at it from the U.S. point of view, like, I don't think there's anything, when Ukrainians say they want us to stay in the game but not win, the U.S. version of that would be keeping Ukraine existing and in a situation in which it can rearm and retake that territory at another time. That is a win. And so I don't expect Ukrainians to share that sense. But that's, when Biden says, or when Blinken says Russia has already lost, that's what they mean.
Yeah, it's very difficult for Ukraine to wrap our minds around. I completely understand what you're trying to say, though, but like understanding that requires a very high level of sophisticated analysis. Is sophisticated even a word?
Sophisticated.
Sophisticated, sorry, analysis and understanding of history. Like, as I
It
said,
also requires not having family who's in jeopardy or been killed or at the front.
Yeah,
not having
yeah.
it requires distance.
It's fair for people to be angry. Like, it's understandable. I just wish that the Ukrainian government was more aware of what you're saying, and it seems like they're not.
It's not their job to be. Their job is.
But it is their job.
No, internally, when they talk to each other, it's their job to understand this stuff. But in their external relations, they should be pushing very hard for their interests. And one thing I really respect about the relationship is that there's very little faux camaraderie. There's some thank you, U.S., blah, blah, blah. But I love the fact that Zelensky is always willing to stand next to Biden and say, thanks, now give us more. And be really unapologetic about...
I feel like the only American who likes that. To be honest.
I love it. I think it's, and it's so in contrast with the way, for example, Israelis talk, where, Israelis talk in this, they talk, their values affinity, their blah, blah, and they'll never just say, just give us more. I don't want to fuck around with this. Just here's what we need. Here's the shopping list. Thanks for items 1, 2, and 6. But 3, 4, and 7 are really important. And 5, I don't want to leave without 5. There's just a quality of like good haggling that and also when you get something, to immediately shift to the next thing. So it was HIMARS, 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 HIMARS. Then you get HIMARS, and it's like, we've never been talking about HIMARS. It's always been about F-16s. F-16s, F-16s, F-16s.
Yeah, that's really funny.
No, I love that. I think it's a healthy quality of the relationship, that it's fundamentally not a transactional relationship. It's actually a relationship in which there's a deep both values affinity and interest affinity. But we talk about it in pretty transactional terms a lot of the time. And I actually think that's healthy, because at the end of the day, these are two countries whose interests don't perfectly align, although they do align on the biggest picture questions.
Yeah, I agree. That's really interesting. I now need a book about the Korean War. Every time you talk, I walk away with like a reading list. Given that we talk every day, I'm about to build a whole new library in here. It's slightly problematic.
Yeah, the Korean War is not one of my areas of expertise. But remember, there's an important fact about the Korean War, which is that it was also a battle against Russia. It was a proxy war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the bodies were the Chinese People's Liberation Army, which operated as the sort of, shock troops of the thing, and there were not Russians involved in the combat on, but basically it was Kim Jong Il and Mao Zedong, back when Stalin, before the Sino-Soviet split. So they were basically operating as Soviet satellites, tried to take South Korea, which was, by the way, at the time, totally undemocratic military dictatorship. And, we kept South Korea in the game for the next 75 years. And we think of that as great, and
I get it. South Korea, I'd go live in South Korea right now. It's a great place.
Yeah, except for the suicide rate.
Jesus Christ, that just turned dark real.
It's got South Korea. I have been meaning to study this. It has not just by a little bit, but by a crazy lot, the highest suicide rate in the world.
Wow. That's
3 or 4 times that of Scandinavia and Western Europe. And
Scandinavia? Oh,
yeah,
but Scandinavia must be low, right? They're the happiest.
Scandinavia is historically high, which people have attributed to the amount of darkness. It's the farthest. But I think Scandinavia has actually done a lot of good work, and they're down at the same level that the US and Germany are now.
Mm.
But Korea is 3 times it's really bad. So
that's an interesting phenomenon. Ukraine and Russia are also doing pretty badly in this.
That's interesting. And does that predate the war, or is that a war stress thing?
No. Pre-war. I think Russia and just countries in Eastern Europe, they're one of the highest in the world as well.
That's interesting. I looked at the numbers to compare the US and Scandinavia recently, because we were having a bit of a conversation about the contribution of gun ownership to suicide rate domestically, and I was so I looked at it, and the thing that jumped out at me was, wow, South Korea's got a serious problem.
And the US has a corruption problem. Your relationship with guns it's so crazy to me. It's also
crazy.
Interesting.
It is crazy, but it is not fundamentally about corruption.
Corruption is a part of it. I mean, what do you call okay, I'm talking about the gun lobby. I understand that it's not the same as Ukrainian corruption kind of thing on a conceptual level, but still at the root of it, it's the money decides. Not the common sense decides the laws. The money decides the laws.
Actually, mostly disagree with that. I think
really?
I think the problem is worse than that. Actually, the problem is that
Dad said moral corruption. That also sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think the problem is that a huge number of Americans really believe in gun rights as fundamental rights, the way I believe in free speech and a free press as fundamental rights. And there's the gun culture is an expression of ideology, more than it is an expression, I think, of the political power flows from the fact that there are huge numbers of people who actually vote on this issue, not because people who don't are, being bought. Now, does it result in that? Yes. But I think the deeper problem is that people really believe in gun rights, and a lot of people in enough states that it actually makes a huge difference.
But this kind of just contributes to my overall feeling, which I know is what I'm about to say is gonna be weird considering that we've discussed me moving to the US a bunch of times. But I've always thought that the US is genuinely not the best place to live, I gotta say. Like there is very few places where I'd want to live, and DC is one of them, just because like it's my favorite city on earth. Like literally, I could like teleport there right now and be happy. Like, but overall, I'm not attracted to like the American way of life because
Every country has its crazed pathologies.
no, but this
And
is like I'm
and
gonna send Ava to school and be scared of her being fucking killed. Like I'm
yeah,
sorry.
look, you're not
Like it's not normal.
you're preaching to the choir. Every country has its pathologies, and ours are real. You know,
It's bad.
we are libertarian to a fault in certain areas. We are inadequately libertarian in other areas, and we don't take care of people when they need being taken care of.
Yes,
The
that's
flip
true.
side of that is that there is immense opportunity to do all kinds of fun stuff. And so I was talking to some Danish people about this, Denmark being almost the
I love to.
prototypically opposite society.
Yes,
And they're like,
yes,
yeah,
it's
you know, life in America is boring, is not good for the average person, but it's really exciting. And life in Denmark is great, and it's really boring. And they were, and so I think we have we do a lot of things really badly. There's just no getting around it.
abortion stuff is. I mean,
Crazy.
I remember when Roe v. Wade happened, and I was still in my famous Twitter person era. I tweeted about it, and this was like years ago. I wasn't pregnant or having a kid yet, and I tweeted something that like I would I would never wish to live in these states or have my daughter live there. Like it's like a taboo. Like literally, even when Eric would joke about us moving to Texas because he's conservative, he's actually more conservative than me. He would like joke about it. I'd nearly get a heart attack at just him saying that. I'm like, no, 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 like over my dead body, we're moving to a red state. And I tweeted about it, and a bunch of people came at me, like various Republicans, being like,
So
"What do you care?"
what is Ukrainian abortion law like?
It's legal and no one gives a shit about it.
It's legal. Is there a time limit?
Yeah, but no one pulls the breathing baby out of the mother and cuts their head off as
No,
trans.
but what is the it's legal up until what point?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it's like I don't know because no one ever talks about it. Like it's just a non-issue. It's just legal and no one cares.
It's interesting that it's so different from Poland in that regard.
Yeah, it's like one of the few things we got right in Poland got wrong.
Yeah, but Poland is like us in that it goes back and forth
Yeah.
on legal abortion. I guess this is an area where the non-centralization of the Orthodox Church versus the centralization of the Catholic Church probably makes a difference.
So it's the first 12 weeks, which is the first 3 months. It's like completely legal. You can just walk in and do it. And then between 12 weeks and 28 weeks, there are reasons, like you can have medical reasons and you can have it done. Or there are some sort of like, they say you can also have like other social or personal reasons, but it only is going to happen in that time limit after like a concilium of like doctors is going to like come together and like little.
So it's very similar to the Roe v. Wade framework.
I guess, yeah. So it's like later it's possible, but there has to be like a thought through decision making. So
yeah, it's actually interestingly similar to Roe v. Wade. And do you know when it dates from? Like, is it a creature of? I assume it's a post-Soviet era.
yes, because before 91 it was a USSR law that governed it. I don't know. I literally I don't know anything about it, as I said, just because like I have never heard like we have issues about LGBTQ, we have like racism, but this no one
Right.
really.
No, it's an interesting, at base, the US is a non-communitarian radical society. And the direction of the radicalism vacillates, right? It can be radically libertarian, it can be radically religious, it can be, but we're fundamentally organized around ideology in the way that European states are fundamentally organized around,
actually having a good life.
well, I mean, a lot of them are organized around, an ethnic polity, or,
Sure, yeah.
And we don't have that. And so we replace it with ideological considerations, and we're way too big for the world of Americans to agree on what having a good life means. Even Canada is better at that than we are.
Yeah, Canada is much better. That's the reason actually why I went to boarding school in Canada. Like literally it came down to safety. Like my parents, I mean, it's not like they knew a whole lot about the realities of life in America. But when we were choosing a boarding school, I actually got accepted into like an Isle of Man, UK island in the middle of nowhere school. And I was going to go there. I literally got accepted there. But then my parents like factored in, and we were deciding between US and Canada, and they were like, well, Canada has a much easier immigration system. So they actually wanted us all to move there. They wanted me to go to university, stay, get work, go through this like typical immigration process, and then they would come and join me and buy property and whatever. Except Canada is fucking boring, especially if you're a journalist. So I moved back.
See
but
that's
the US, they were like, the US is just not a safe place for like a 15-year-old.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
So in the 4 minutes we have left, how did you come as a 15-year-old to demand that your parents send you to boarding school?
Oh, this is a great story. I love it. So I went to what is it called? To a summer camp. And for context, I was always a very curious child. I loved reading, I loved learning, but I fucking hated the Ukrainian education system. So if it was like, if there was a good teacher that I liked, or a good like subject like literature or English, then I did like absolute best. I was very engaging, whatever. But if it was something like physics or math and I hated the teacher, I didn't do shit. So the problem clearly was that like my educational spirit just wasn't fitting in within the system. And then I went to the summer camp and I met this girl who spoke fluent English, and she was Ukrainian. It was a Ukrainian summer camp. And at that time, I was already learning English for years and years with a private tutor. So I immediately got drawn to her because I was like, oh my God, like she doesn't have any accent. She's so cool. Let me like talk to her to practice. And I was like, okay, where did you learn English so well? And she said that she goes to a boarding school in where? In the Czech Republic. And I was like, oh, so this is, and the typical thing that everyone says is like, oh, is this like in American movies? They have lockers, it's like, that's what all Ukrainians think of boarding school. And she told me about it. She like literally, it's a school in Karlovy Vary. She like literally showed it to me. And I was like, oh my God. And she told me how it was an AB system school. And she told me that she was like dying from how hard it was, but still it was this amazing experience. And I immediately, like, I literally spent like a week with her in the summer camp. I read everything about the school, and I texted this huge message to my parents being like, okay, here you go, fellas. I am going to Czech Republic. My mom was like, shut up. You can't even wash your own mug after yourself. Like, you're not moving to another country. But I came back home from the summer camp. I showed it to my dad and I was like, look, this is awesome, blah, blah, blah. He like read the whole thing. And the thing that these international schools do is that for the summer, they host English camps because they don't have the students there. So they need to make money somehow. And I was like, look, they have like a summer camp for English learning in like 3 weeks. Maybe we'd like just go and check it out. And he was like, sure. And like literally he just agreed. So I like applied for the camp. And we all drove to Czech Republic like 3 weeks later. Him and my mom just hung out, had like a little romantic getaway, and I was in this thing. And while I was in the camp, I also applied like to the school for the following year to just kind of like get a feel of what it's like. At this point, I was barely speaking English, by the way. Like my speaking was terrible. I was terrified of speaking. So it all goes great. I make friends with people who are already students there. I'm like imagining my life there. Like I'm like already studying there. And then my parents tear my heart away, break all of my dreams, and suddenly become terrible because they say that, like, come on, like, we're not going to make this decision in a month. Like, you need to go back to your Ukrainian school for another year. And throughout this year, we need to like actually choose like a good proper school, make like a whole decision process. By the way, you're really lagging. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you just fine. We
Okay,
need to wrap up, though.
okay, I'm almost done.
Okay.
Okay. So the next school year, I like do the bare fucking minimum at my Ukrainian school because in my mind I'm already in the UK studying in a boarding school. So I'm like literally, I'm
And
not
did
kidding.
you
The
imagine
entire
it like Hogwarts?
pretty much.
Yeah.
The entire year I'm like researching every school possible. So much so like everywhere in the world, like Sydney, Australia, like everywhere. I'm just researching boarding schools. Moreover, I'm applying to boarding schools. I'm literally using my mom's email, taking photos of my documents. I'm emailing to the school being like, "Hi, my name is Irina, my mom's name. My daughter wants to go here. What is the application process?" I'm not kidding. My parents have no idea. Like, they're not plugged in at all. They just know that I'm doing it. So then in a few months, I tell my mom, I'm like, "Mom, I have an interview in a week." And she's like, "Interview where? Like, what are you fucking talking about?" So I end up having the interview and get accepted to the school. And my parents had like no input into this process whatsoever. And the school accepts me. And then my parents are like, okay, maybe this isn't just some sort of random kid's thought that's going to go away. She actually seems really like committed to this idea. So that's when they get involved and like we actually properly go about the process, choose the school, whatever. So
Great story.
Yeah.
And we are going to close on that story, accidentally live streamed to YouTube. And we will be back tomorrow with who's tomorrow? Oh, with Windsor Man, the great Windsor Man, who will I have many one-liners to exchange with, and then we will talk to Pete Struck, who will be wearing a dog shirt on Thursday. Join us then. Thanks, Nastya.